Bartholomew Kane didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door of the Blackstone Ridge land office like he owned it, which, in his mind, he already owned everything worth owning in this territory. He dropped a leather folder onto the clerk's desk, and inside that folder was a single document with a woman's name on it, not Evelyn Ashcroft, the real name, Marin Whitlock. "Send word to Gideon Mercer," Kane said, straightening his coat without looking at the clerk. "Tell him his bride isn't who he thinks she is. Tell him I know exactly who she is." He smiled at the wall. "And tell him I'll be coming to collect what that information is worth." He walked out without waiting for a response. Somewhere across the ridge, in a ranch house lit by a single oil lamp, a woman who had been living under a borrowed name set a dish on the table and called out that supper was ready, and had no idea that the ground beneath her was about to open up. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you're exactly where we want you. Hit that like button right now, drop your city or country in the comments so we can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what's coming. Because this one goes all the way to the bone. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late, which gave Gideon Mercer plenty of time to reconsider every decision he'd made in the past 11 months. He stood at the edge of the platform, hat pulled low against the afternoon glare, one boot resting on the bottom rail of the hitching post. Around him, the usual crowd had gathered, not because stagecoaches were uncommon in Blackstone Ridge, but because this stagecoach was carrying Gideon Mercer's mail-order bride, and news like that didn't stay private for long in a town of 400 people. Tom Grady from the feed store stood 15 feet away pretending to check his pocket watch. The Dunmore sisters had found reasons to be near the general store at exactly this hour. Sheriff Lyle Boone leaned against the post office wall with his arms crossed, and the specific expression of a man who wanted to look disinterested but kept glancing at the road. Gideon noticed all of it. He said nothing. He wasn't a man who talked much to begin with. 33 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders from 2 decades of actual ranch work rather than the pantomime of it, with calloused hands and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the ridge the town was named after. People in Blackstone Ridge respected Gideon Mercer. Some of them feared him a little, though he'd never given them reason to. It was just the way he carried himself, steady, contained, never hurried, as if the world moved at the pace he allowed it. But today, for the first time in longer than he could remember, his hands weren't quite steady. He pressed the fingers of his right hand flat against his thigh and made himself breathe slowly. 11 months of letters. That was what it came down to. 11 months of sitting at the kitchen table after a long day, reading words that somehow reached through the paper and found something in him he'd stopped believing was still there. The first letter had been careful, formal, the kind you'd expect from a woman answering an advertisement. But by the third, something had shifted. By the fifth, he'd started looking forward to the end of the day in a way he hadn't since before his father died and left him the ranch and all the weight that came with it. She wrote about small things the way other people forgot to. The particular color of a field in late autumn, the sound rain made on a tin roof if you listened to it without trying to sleep through it, the way a good horse moved when it finally trusted you. She wrote about her fears plainly, without dressing them up. She asked him questions that weren't the ones he expected, not, do you own your land outright, or how many head of cattle, but what do you do when a day goes wrong and you can't fix it, and do you think a person can change the parts of themselves they've carried too long? He'd stayed up past midnight answering those questions. He'd answered them honestly, which wasn't something he'd been particularly practiced at before. The sound of wheels on the road brought him back. The stagecoach came around the bend trailing a ribbon of dust, and Gideon straightened without meaning to. Behind him he heard the small shuffle of people repositioning themselves. Tom Grady's pocket watch disappeared. The coach rolled to a stop. The driver climbed down. The door swung open. The first person out was an older man in a business suit clutching a hat box to his chest. Then a young couple, probably newly married themselves, both of them blinking against the light. Then a woman in a gray traveling dress who reached back inside for a battered leather case before stepping down onto the platform. And the moment her feet touched the boards, Gideon felt something go still inside him. Not in a good way. Not in the way he'd been expecting. She was in her mid-20s, fine-featured, with dark hair pinned up neatly and a dress that had seen better days. She wasn't plain, but she wasn't right, was the only word his brain produced, and he stood there trying to understand what he meant by it while she scanned the platform and found him. And something that might have been relief, or might have been pure terror, moved across her face. She walked toward him carefully, like someone navigating ice. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but her hands were gripping that leather case so hard the knuckles had gone white. "That's right." He kept his voice neutral. "And you're—" "Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn Ashcroft." A beat too fast. The name landed in the air between them like something dropped rather than placed. And there it was. Gideon had read 11 months of letters from Evelyn Ashcroft. He knew the rhythm of how she thought. He knew the way she built a sentence, the particular turns of phrase she returned to when she was being earnest, the gentle irony she deployed when she was testing an idea. He knew that she'd told him her mother had called her unnecessarily stubborn her entire childhood, and that she'd worn it as a compliment ever since. He knew that she got up before dawn not from habit, but because the first hour of daylight made her feel like something was being given back. The woman standing in front of him had not written those letters. I was certain of it, the way he was certain of other things he couldn't fully explain, the way he could read weather 3 hours before it arrived, the way he could tell from the set of a horse's ears whether it was nervous or angry. Something fundamental was off, and he understood it completely in the span of about 4 seconds. The woman, Evelyn, she'd said, holding on to the name with both hands, was still watching him with that carefully arranged expression, and underneath it he could see she was terrified. Not nervous, not anxious in the way you'd expect from someone arriving in a new place to meet a stranger they were supposed to marry. Terrified. The kind of fear that came from carrying something heavy for a long time and not knowing when it was going to give. Gideon made a decision. He picked up her leather case. "Long trip," he said. "You hungry?" She blinked. Yes, I suppose I am." "Good." He turned it toward the wagon, case in hand, and raised his voice just enough for Tom Grady and the Dunmore sisters to hear. "There's a decent stew waiting, better than anything you'd find at the hotel." He didn't look back to see if she was following. He heard her footsteps behind him after a moment, quick, uncertain, catching up. And something in his chest did something complicated that he chose not to examine right then. Behind him, he heard Tom Grady mutter something to his companion. He didn't catch the words, but he caught the tone, and it was the tone of someone who'd been hoping for a better show. They didn't get one. Not today. The ride back to the ranch took the better part of an hour. For the first 20 minutes, neither of them said anything. The woman, he was already having trouble thinking of her as Evelyn, which was a problem he was going to have to deal with eventually, sat straight-backed on the wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape change from town to open range with an expression he couldn't quite read. She wasn't flinching at the terrain. She wasn't asking foolish questions about the distance or whether there were Indians or whether the winters were really as bad as people said. She just watched. He'd expected her to fill the silence. Most people did. The silence made people talk. She didn't. He almost respected her for it. "How was the crossing?" he asked finally, because someone had to say something. "Long. Crowded." She paused. "The train from St. Louis was delayed 3 days. There was a problem with the tracks. I heard they'd been having trouble with that line." "Have you traveled it?" "Not in years." Another silence. But this one was different, a fraction less rigid, as if they'd both agreed without saying so to let the first exchange settle before starting another. "The land is different than I imagined," she said. "Different how?" She thought about it. He appreciated that she thought about it rather than answering immediately. "Bigger," she said finally. "In photographs, everything looks contained, like you can see where it ends. Out here, it just keeps going. Does that bother you?" She looked at him then, the first real direct look since she'd stepped off the platform. "No," she said, and she sounded surprised by her own answer. "I don't think it does." He nodded and returned his eyes to the road. The ranch came into view around the last bend. The main house, the barn, the smaller outbuildings arranged with practical rather than aesthetic purpose. A line of cottonwoods along the creek that caught the late sun and turned it to something almost worth looking at. He watched her watching it and tried to gauge her reaction without being obvious about it. She didn't say, "Oh, how lovely," or "It's smaller than I expected," or any of the things he half feared. She said, "There's water." Creek runs along the back property line. Never goes dry, not even in the worst summers. That's valuable out here. Most valuable thing on the land. More valuable than the cattle? Cattle don't survive without water. Water survives without cattle. So yes. She looked at the tree line again. Bartholomew Kane, she said, and he went very still. I heard that name on the stage. 2 men talking about him. They said he's been trying to buy up water rights in this county. Kane's been trying to get his hands on my creek for 7 years, Gideon said. Hasn't managed it. What stopped him? I have. She turned to look at him again, and this time he couldn't tell what she was thinking at all. Fair enough, she said. She slept in the guest room, the room he'd set aside for this, made up with clean sheets and a pitcher of water and the one decent quilt his mother had left behind. He'd set the household up as properly as he could manage, which wasn't saying much given that it was a ranch house occupied by one man who spent most of his time outside. He lay awake in his own room for a long time listening to the dark. She was not Evelyn Ashcroft. He turned the fact over and examined it from every angle, the way he'd turn over a stone to see what was underneath. The letters were real. That much he was sure of. Whatever else was happening, the person who had written those letters had put genuine thought into every word, genuine self into every page. You couldn't fake that, not across 11 months, not with that kind of consistency and depth. The person who had written, I think, loneliness is less about being alone and more about being unseen, had meant it. The woman in the guest room had written those letters. He was as sure of that as he was of anything. So who was she? And what had happened to the name on the envelopes? He was still working through it when he heard the sound. Faint, from the direction of the kitchen. He got up quietly, pulled on his boots, and moved down the hallway without a lamp. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Not crying. Her eyes were dry, her hands flat on the table surface. She was just sitting, the way people sit when they're trying to keep themselves from coming apart. She heard him in the doorway. Her head came up. I'm sorry, she said. I couldn't sleep. Neither could I. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. You want me to light the lamp? No. A pause. Not yet. They sat in the dark across from each other for a moment. I need to tell you something, she said. Her voice was careful, each word placed deliberately. I need to tell you that I'm not... She stopped. Started again. The name I gave you at the station, it isn't mine. He waited. My name is Marin. Marin Whitlock. She kept her eyes on the table. Evelyn Ashcroft is my sister. She's older. She's the one who answered your advertisement, the one you were expecting. And I came instead. Why? The word came out quieter than he intended. She looked up at it. Because she left, Marin said. 3 weeks before the journey, she met someone, a man from Cincinnati, and she went with him, and she left behind the debts she'd taken on for the travel and the plans she'd made and the letters she'd written, except she hadn't really written most of them. Her jaw tightened. I had. I'd been writing them since the 4th one. She struggled to put things into words. She asked me to help. And then she stopped asking, and I kept writing. To me, Gideon said. To you. For 11 months. Yes. He let the silence sit for a moment. Outside, something moved in the darkness near the barn. Probably just a coyote working the perimeter, a sound he'd long since stopped reacting to. Why didn't you just tell me, he asked, when you arrived, or by letter, before you came? Because I didn't know what I would be arriving to. She looked at her hands. A man who'd been writing to my sister for nearly a year. A man who had a picture of her in his mind. I didn't know if you'd send me back and what would happen to my family when you did, or if you'd... She stopped. I didn't know what you'd do. And now? She looked at him across the dark kitchen. Now I still don't know. Gideon leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked under him. He thought about 11 months of letters. He thought about the question she'd asked him once. Do you think a person can change the parts of themselves they've carried too long? And the answer he'd written back. I think some people are so busy carrying them they forget to put them down. He thought about the name Marin. It fit her better than the other one had. You wrote everything I valued in those letters, he said. That was you. Yes. The question about the rain on the tin roof. Something moved in her face. Yes. The thing about your mother calling you unnecessarily stubborn. That was, yes, that was my mother. That was me. He nodded slowly. Then we don't have a problem with who you are, he said. We have a problem with what we do about it. He stood up, chair scraping softly against the floor. And that problem can wait until morning. You should sleep. She stared at him. That's all you're going to say? For tonight. He moved toward the hallway. The guest room's yours as long as you need it, Marin. He heard her draw a sharp breath at the sound of her own name. He didn't turn around. She was up before he was the next morning. He came out at first light and found her in the yard near the barn, filling the water trough from the pump with an efficiency that suggested she was not a stranger to the work. She'd changed into older clothes, rougher fabric, sensible. Her hair was pulled back practically. You don't need to do that, he said. I know. She didn't stop. I needed something to do. He watched her for a moment, then picked up the other bucket and took over the far end of the trough. They worked in parallel for a few minutes without talking. How much do you know about ranching? He asked. Some. My family had land when I was younger. Before. She pumped without looking at him. Before things went bad. What kind of things? The kind that take everything you've built and let someone else pick it apart. A pause. A man convinced my father to sign over the mineral rights on the property. Said it was a standard arrangement. It wasn't. Gideon set down his bucket and looked at her. Cain? No, someone like him. She looked at him then, level and steady. That's how I knew the name when I heard it on the stage. Men like that tend to sound the same. He didn't say anything for a moment. I'm sorry about your family's land, he said finally. I'm sorry I lied to you, she said. About the name, about all of it. You told me the truth last night, after I'd already arrived under someone else's name. Yes. He picked up the bucket again. You did. He heard her exhale. Not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. Something between. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said. I need to move the south pasture fence before the rains come, and the horse with the bad hoof needs checking. If you know what you're doing around a barn, I could use the help. She stood very still for a moment. Then she set her own bucket down and said, Show me the horse. And they went together, walking across the yard in the early morning light, neither of them saying anything more, and somehow that felt, not like an answer exactly, but like the beginning of one. The days that followed had their own rhythm. Not a comfortable one, not at first. There was too much unspoken for it to be comfortable. But it was a working rhythm, tasks that needed doing, decisions that needed making, a ranch that did not care about the complicated arrangement of the two people trying to maintain it. The fence got moved, the horse's hoof was treated. 3 calves came early in a cold night rain, and Marin was there for all of it, not hovering uselessly at the edge, but doing what needed to be done, hands in it, not flinching. Gideon worked beside her and watched without making it obvious. She wasn't performing. That was the thing. Some people, when they were trying to prove something, got a certain quality about them. A performance of capability, of willingness, of look how useful I am. Marin didn't have that. She worked the way she'd worked at the water trough that first morning, because something needed doing and she was there to do it. She made mistakes. She misjudged the disposition of the older mare twice and got herself knocked sideways once for it, and she miscounted feed once and had to redo it. And each time she just absorbed the mistake and corrected course. He trusted people who made mistakes and fixed them more than people who didn't make any. He also trusted her hands. There was a way she moved around animals that told him what she'd said about her family's land was true. She'd grown up working. She hadn't been born to it and then left it. It was in her. On the 4th evening, she said at the supper table, You knew when I got off the stage. He looked at her. You knew it was wrong, she said. Right away. I could see it. He considered lying. It would have been easy enough. Yes, he said instead. And you didn't say anything. No. Why? He picked up his fork, set it back down. Because you were scared, he said, and making a spectacle of it wouldn't have helped either of us. It would have been the practical thing to do, she said. Send me back. Find out what happened to my sister. Start over. I'm not interested in practical. She gave him a look that was part disbelief, part something else he couldn't name. "You're a rancher," she said. "Everything about your life is practical." "That's why I can afford to not be sometimes." He picked up his fork again. "Eat your supper, Marin." She ate her supper, but she was quiet for the rest of the evening in a way that felt like thinking rather than withdrawal, and he found himself curious about what she was working through. 3 weeks in, they were riding the fence line when the trouble found them. Not Kane, not yet, just two of his men, recognizable by the brand on their horses, a double K that Kane registered with something close to pride. They were sitting their horses at the property boundary when Gideon and Marin came over the rise, and they didn't move when they saw them coming. "Mercer," the closer one said. He had a broad face and an easy lean that was meant to look casual but wasn't. "Mr. Kane wanted us to pass along his regards." "You can pass them back," Gideon said. "He also wanted to mention he's heard you've had some changes up at the house. New arrangements." The man's eyes moved to Marin with a deliberateness that was designed to be noticed. "Pretty ones." Marin didn't react. She kept her eyes on the man and her face told him nothing. "You're on the line," Gideon said. "Other side of it is yours. This side is mine." Just passing along a greeting. "You've passed it. You can go now." The man held the moment for a few extra seconds, long enough to make sure everyone understood he was choosing to leave rather than being made to, and then wheeled his horse and his companion followed, and they rode back the way they came. Gideon watched until they were well away. "He already knows," Marin said quietly. It wasn't a question. "He has ears all over this county. Always has." He turned his horse back toward the ranch. "Don't let it show that it bothers you." "It doesn't bother me." A pause. "It frightens me." He looked at her. "Which is different," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." They rode back in the afternoon sun, and Gideon turned over in his mind what Kane already knowing meant, and what it was going to cost them, and he didn't have a good answer yet. But the woman riding beside him sat straight and steady on her horse and didn't ask him to fix it, and he found that meant something to him that he wasn't quite ready to put words to. The evening came in gold and slow across the ridge. Somewhere out past the cottonwoods, a hawk worked the updrafts, rising without effort, catching something invisible. Marin watched it until it disappeared. He watched her watch it. Inside the house, the kitchen lamp waited to be lit. The cattle were settled, the fence was whole, and tomorrow, whatever Kane was planning, was still tomorrow. The hawk was gone by the time they unsaddled the horses, but Marin kept thinking about it through supper and through the quiet hour after, when Gideon sat at the table with his account ledgers, and she sat near the window with a mending basket she'd found in the back of the linen closet. She wasn't sure whose it had been. She hadn't asked. She was learning which questions to ask and which ones to leave alone. The men at the fence line had unsettled her more than she'd let show. It wasn't the words they'd used. She'd heard worse, from men with sharper tongues and less patience for the performance of politeness. It was the ease of them, the way they'd sat their horses like they had every right to be there, like the boundary line was a suggestion rather than a fact. Men who worked for someone like Kane didn't develop that posture on their own. It was given to them, along with the horses and the wages. It meant their employer had been operating without real resistance for long enough that resistance had started to feel theoretical. She set down the shirt she was mending and looked at Gideon across the room. He was frowning at the ledger, not in frustration, but in the concentrated way of a man working through a real problem, his finger moving along a column of numbers. He had a habit of pressing his thumbnail against his lower lip when he was thinking hard. She'd noticed it on the third day and had been noticing it since. "The creek," she said. "How much of it runs through your land?" He looked up. "About 1.5 miles, maybe a little more." "And Kane's nearest property?" "half-mile east of my eastern line." "So if he had your land, he'd have direct access." "If he had my land, he'd control every water source between the North Ridge and the county road." He leaned back in his chair, "which is why he's been at it for 7 years. "What's he tried?" "Everything short of outright theft." He closed the ledger. "Low offers. Higher offers. Men at the fence. He had a lawyer send me a letter once claiming my grandfather's original deed had an error in the boundary description. I hired my own lawyer. The error wasn't there." "He backed off?" "For a while." Gideon looked at the lamp on the table. "He doesn't stay gone. He just waits for a different angle. Maren picked up the mending again. Her needle went through the fabric steadily, in and out. He'll use me, she said. Probably. He already knows something is wrong based on what those men said. Something, yes. Whether he knows the specifics yet, Gideon stopped. He will. If he doesn't already. She kept her eyes on the mending. When he does, what will you do? He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. I haven't decided, he said, which she suspected was the most honest answer he could give, and she appreciated it more than a confident one would have been. She nodded and went back to the shirt. Outside, the wind came up and moved through the cottonwoods with that particular sound it made when the season was beginning to shift. Not cold yet, but getting ready to remember how. Maren had grown up in Ohio, where the seasons announced themselves with some courtesy. Out here they seemed to arrive the way everything arrived, without much warning and expecting you to manage. She was beginning to understand why he was the way he was. The land made you certain things. It left no room for the ones it couldn't use. October arrived with a week of hard work and one genuinely bad day. The bad day started with 3 steers breaking through the fence on the north pasture and spending the morning ranging in the wrong direction, and ended with Gideon's second-best horse throwing a shoe in a wash and coming up lame in the left foreleg. Between those 2 events, a supply wagon from town arrived with half the order wrong, and a note from the merchant explaining that the prices had gone up and would Gideon be confirming the new arrangement. Gideon looked at the note for a long moment. That's Deacon Fry's hand, he said. You know him? He's been selling supplies in this county for 20 years. He's never once raised prices without talking to me first. He folded the note. Kane has a stake in that store. Maren looked at the wagon, half unloaded, sitting in the yard. A stake since when? Since about 2 months ago, based on what I heard at the last cattle market. He tucked the note in his shirt pocket. Didn't think it would reach this far this fast. She helped him unload what was there and sort out what was missing, and she watched him move through the problem with a controlled precision that kept the frustration from becoming something worse. He didn't slam things down. He didn't raise his voice at the wagon driver, who was clearly uncomfortable and clearly not responsible for the decisions that had produced this situation. He just worked through it, item by item, and made a list of what would need to come from elsewhere. But that evening, when the driver had gone and the horse was resting and the steers were back where they belonged, she found Gideon standing at the fence at the edge of the yard, both hands on the top rail, looking at nothing in particular. She walked out and stood beside him. You don't have to say anything useful, he said, without turning his head. I wasn't planning to. They stood there for a while. The sun was going down behind the ridge, the sky turning the colors. It turned out here that she still wasn't entirely used to. Not the soft watercolor of Ohio evenings, but something rawer, more insistent. It's going to get worse before it gets better, he said. Usually does. Maren. He turned and looked at her. You understand that what Kane knows, or suspects, he's going to use. And whatever he has on you, whatever truth he's carrying around. He stopped. I need you to be prepared for that. She met his eyes. I've been prepared for it since I stepped off that stage. That's not the same as being ready for it to happen. No, she said. It isn't. She looked back at the ridge. But I don't have the luxury of falling apart about it, so... He studied her for a moment with the specific expression of a man reassessing something. You had a hard time of it, he said, before you came here. Not just with your sister. Before. It wasn't quite a question. She told him about her family's land on that first morning at the water trough. And she told him enough in the weeks since. In pieces. In the way things come out when you're working alongside someone and your guard drops because you're tired, that he had a partial picture. The years after her father lost the land, the work she and her mother had done to keep the household going, the way her sister Evelyn had approached the mail order arrangement, not as a romantic gamble, but as a practical solution to an ongoing problem. I managed, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. I asked if it was hard, he said, not whether you survived it. Something in her chest did a thing she didn't particularly want it to do. She controlled it. Yes, she said. It was hard. A pause. Harder than I let most people see. He nodded, like she'd confirmed something. Then he turned back to the fence line and the dimming sky. The merchant situation. I'll handle it, he said. There are two other suppliers within a day's ride. Kane can't own all of them. Not yet. Not yet, she agreed. Cheerful of you. I believe in being accurate. He made a short sound that was almost, not quite, a laugh. It surprised them both enough that neither of them acknowledged it, and after a moment they walked back toward the house in the gathering dark. 2 more weeks passed, and Marin settled in the way she hadn't quite expected to settle. Not gradually, but in stages, like a structure finding its foundation. She learned the personalities of each animal on the property. She learned which boards on the porch were unreliable, and where the cellar let in damp, and how long the kitchen stove took to come to temperature on cold mornings, which was longer than you'd want if you were hungry and impatient, which she was sometimes, though she got better at starting it early. She also learned things about Gideon that he didn't tell her directly. She learned he had a habit of checking the property line closest to Kane's land every morning before breakfast, a routine so ingrained he probably didn't notice he was doing it anymore. She learned he wrote letters to his younger brother in Colorado once a month, carefully, and that the letters cost him something. She could tell by the way he sat at the table differently when he was writing them, more carefully, like the words were harder to find. She learned that the one thing he was genuinely impatient about was incompetence in a crisis, but patient almost beyond reason with things that just needed time. She noticed that he tested her sometimes. Not to be unkind, she understood it wasn't that. He was a man who'd been let down enough times that he needed to confirm, quietly and consistently, that the things he believed about a person were actually true. He'd ask her something she'd mentioned weeks ago, worked into a new conversation, to see if her answer was the same. He'd give her a task with one instruction missing and watch to see how she handled the gap. She caught on by the second week and found that she didn't mind it. She'd have done the same. She also noticed the letters. She'd found them on the third day, not by snooping. She'd been looking for paper to write a note about the fence repair supplies they needed, and she'd opened the wrong drawer in the kitchen desk, and there they were. A bundle of envelopes tied with a piece of leather cord, her sister's name on the return address, but her own handwriting looking back at her. She'd shut the drawer immediately, but she'd known they were there after that, and she'd thought about them more than was comfortable. One evening, about a month in, she was banking the kitchen fire when Gideon came in from the barn and went to the desk for something. His record book, she thought, and opened the wrong drawer himself, or maybe not the wrong one because he paused with his hand in it for a moment before finding what he'd actually come for. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But something had shifted between them that hadn't been there before, and they both knew it, and neither of them was quite ready to name it. The first snow came in the second week of November, earlier than anyone expected. Marin woke at 4 in the morning to a sound she couldn't immediately place, a heaviness in the air, a silence that was somehow louder than the usual quiet. She got up and looked out the window and found the world white and the snow still falling, and her first thought was the cattle. She dressed fast and went out before she even went to Gideon's door. The cattle were in the south pasture, she knew from the evening before, when they'd moved them from the north to take advantage of the better windbreak. She got to the barn, got the horse tacked quickly, made one error she caught before it became a problem, a strap she'd buckled out of order in the dark, and corrected it and went out into the snow. The cattle were already drifting toward the low ground, which was the wrong direction. Low ground in a snow like this filled up and got dangerous fast. She moved them before they got far, pushing them back toward the windbreak grove, and she had most of them there by the time she heard another horse and looked up and found Gideon coming across the white field toward her. He pulled up beside her. "How many?" he said. "I count 31. Wasn't there 34 yesterday?" 34. His eyes swept the field. 3 somewhere. They split up. He went east toward the gully she'd been worried about, and she went north along the fence line, moving slowly through the snow, calling in the low sound that the cattle responded to, and she found 2 of the 3 at the fence corner where they'd gotten confused and were standing with their heads down, too cold to move much. She got them turned and pushed them back across the field, and by the time she reached the grove, Gideon was there with the 3rd one, and all 34 were accounted for. They stood in the dark and snow for a moment, both of them breathing hard, horses blowing steam. "You went out before you woke me," he said. Not accusing, just noting it. "There wasn't time to—" "I know." He looked at her. In the gray-white light of the she could see his face clearly, and there was something in it she hadn't quite seen before. Not just approval, but something more personal than that. Something almost undone. Next time wake me anyway, he said. 2 is safer than 1. All right, she said. Marin. I said all right, Gideon. He looked at her another second and then turned his horse back toward the barn. They put the animals up and got inside near dawn, both of them cold through, and she made coffee while he got the stove built up, and they sat across the kitchen table with their hands wrapped around their cups, and neither of them said much. The snow kept falling outside. It stacked up on the windowsill in a soft line. How's your hands? He asked. She looked at them. Fine. Let me see. They're fine, Gideon. I'm asking to see them. She put them on the table. He leaned forward and looked at them. Checked the knuckles, the fingertips, the places where cold took hold fastest. He was clinical about it, efficient, but his thumbs moved across the back of her hands with a gentleness that was different from efficiency, and she kept her eyes on the table and didn't say anything. Not frostbitten, he said, but close. I've been colder. That's a terrible thing to say. She looked up at him and found that he almost meant it as a joke. Not quite. I know, she said, but it's true. He released her hands and picked up his coffee again. You told me once, he said, in a letter. He paused, and she heard him choosing to continue rather than pull back. You said you thought courage was mostly just habit, doing the next thing because you'd done the last thing. She remembered writing it. She remembered the night she'd written it, sitting at the desk in her room in Ohio while her mother slept and the debts on the table were what they were, and she'd been trying to explain something true about herself to a stranger who had asked the right question. I meant it, she said. I know you did. He looked at his coffee. I think you're right about that. She watched him for a moment. Do you practice it? She asked. The habit. Every day. He didn't look up. Some days it's harder than others. She nodded. Outside the snow was slowing. The sky was getting the faint gray of early morning that wasn't quite light yet but was getting ready. She thought about the cattle settled in the grove. She thought about the fence line and Kane's men and the supply wagon and the ledger numbers she'd seen over his shoulder twice now and understood were tighter than he said they were. She thought about the letters in the desk drawer. Gideon, she said. He looked at her. I know you've read them, she said. The letters. I know you know they're mine. Not because you told me, but because... She stopped. Because you're not a man who doesn't notice things. And you've known for a while. He didn't confirm it or deny it. He just looked at her, waiting. I need to say it plainly, she said. Not because I think you need me to, but because I need to have said it. She put her hands flat on the table. Everything in those letters was mine. Every word. My sister's name was on them, but every thought and question and every honest thing in them came from me. That's not an excuse for the deception, but it's the truth of it. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I knew that before you told me. I figured. Marin. He waited until she looked at him. The letters were why I didn't send you back, not the name on them. What was in them? She held his gaze. Something moved through her that was uncomfortable and necessary, like a splinter working its way out. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. They finished the coffee. The sky outside turned from gray to pale, and then to the thin blue of a winter morning after snow, and the ranch was quiet and white and entirely theirs. And whatever was growing between them continued to grow without either of them naming it, which was probably the only way it was going to survive long enough to matter. The knock at the door came on a Thursday, just before noon. Marin was in the barn when she heard it. She heard the horse react to the sound of an unfamiliar vehicle on the road, and she looked through the gap in the boards and saw the buggy pull into the yard. Fine buggy. Good horse. Expensive lines on both. She set down what she was doing and walked to the barn door and looked out. The man who climbed down was heavy-set, well-dressed in the way of men who wanted you to register that they were well-dressed, with a face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and had since settled into something that suggested it had been given whatever it wanted too often. He adjusted his coat. He looked at the house, then looked at the barn, and found Marin. She knew who he was before he said a word. There was only one man in this county whose arrival required that quality of self-presentation. Bartholomew Kane walked toward her across the yard and stopped at a distance that was just close enough to make a point. You'd be the new Mrs. Mercer, he said, pleasantly. The pleasantness of a man who'd decided what this conversation would be before he got in the buggy. "I'd be working in the barn," Marin said. "Can I help you with something?" Something flickered in his eyes. A small recalibration. He smiled. "I was hoping to have a word with Gideon. He's not here right now." "Ah." He looked around the yard, not hurrying. Lovely property, that creek. He tilted his head toward the cottonwoods. "I don't think people fully appreciate what a resource like that is worth, not until they need it." "Mr. Kane," she said, because there was no point in pretending she didn't know who he was. "If you have business with Gideon, you can come back when he's here." He looked at her with the expression of a man who'd been waiting for her to show her cards. "I hear you've come a long way," he said. "Quite a journey to make for someone else's arrangement." Her heartbeat stayed level. She'd been waiting for this conversation in some form since the men at the fence line, and she'd had time to decide what her face would do when it arrived. "Long journeys are common out here," she said. "People come from everywhere." "Indeed they do." He took one more casual look around, the look of a man taking inventory. "You know, I've done a fair amount of business back east. Keep in touch with contacts there. It's useful to know who's who." His eyes came back to her. "Whitlock family from Ohio, if I'm not mistaken. Father lost a property some years back, couple of daughters." Marin looked at him without blinking. "I must be thinking of someone else," he said, with the smile of a man who was not thinking of someone else. "Well, tell Gideon I stopped by." He turned back toward the buggy. "And that I'd be glad to sit down with him at his convenience. I have a proposal I think he'll find worth considering." He paused with one hand on the buggy door. "It's always better to resolve these things before they become complicated, don't you think?" He climbed up and turned the horse, and the buggy moved out of the yard at an unhurried pace, and Marin stood at the barn door and watched it go, and felt the cold that had nothing to do with the season. He knew. He knew enough. Maybe not everything, but enough to use. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the grain of the wood for a while. When Gideon came back an hour later and found her there, she told him everything. Every word, beginning to end, as accurately as she could reproduce it. She watched his face go through several things while she talked, none of them visible to someone who didn't know him, but she'd learned to read the small signals by now. When she finished, he was quiet. "He was measuring you," Gideon said, "not just delivering a message. He wanted to see how you'd react." "I know. How do you think you did?" She considered it honestly. He didn't get a reaction, but he already knew enough that he didn't need one. Gideon put his hat on the table. He'd been holding it since he came in. "He's going to move," he said, "sooner than I expected." "What does that mean for us?" He looked at her. At the word us, he looked at her with a specificity she felt more than saw. "It means we don't have the luxury of time," he said. "Whatever we're going to decide about the land, about you, about what we're calling this arrangement, we need to decide it before he forces the decision for us." "What are you saying?" He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the yard, at the place where Kane's buggy had stood. "I'm saying," he said slowly, "that a man with nothing to hide is a man who has nothing Kane can take from him." He turned and looked at her. "And right now, the only thing Kane actually has is the question of who you are." She understood where he was going. She wasn't sure she was ready for it. "Gideon, I'm not saying do anything today." He held up a hand. "I'm saying think about it, what it would mean to tell the truth before he can tell it for us." She looked at him across the kitchen. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with that sound that was almost like water. The late afternoon light lay across the floor in a long gold strip. "Everything Kane has," she said carefully, "is the fact that I'm not who I said I was when I arrived." "Yes. If we say it ourselves, he has nothing." She pressed her fingers against the table and thought about what it meant, standing in front of people who had already formed opinions about her. Gideon explaining why he'd allowed it. The questions that would come, the judgments, the raised eyebrows over supper tables she'd never sit at. "People might not forgive it," she said. "Some won't," he agreed. He wasn't going to lie to her about that. "It could cost you." "It could." She looked at him. "And you'd do it anyway." He met her eyes. "I'd rather lose something real than keep something borrowed," he said. "That's how I'm built." She thought about her father signing a paper he didn't fully understand. She thought about her sister leaving without a word. She thought about 11 months of letters, her own words traveling west under someone else's name, finding a man who had read them carefully enough to know them as hers even before she arrived. She thought about the letters in the drawer. "I need to think," she said. "Take the time you need." She nodded. He picked up his hat and went back outside, giving her the kitchen and the quiet and the long gold light, and she sat with it all and tried to figure out what kind of person she wanted to be when the thing she'd been dreading finally arrived. She already half knew the answer. She just needed to be sure. She thought about it for 3 days. Not in the way of someone stalling. She wasn't built for stalling, and Gideon seemed to understand that without being told. He didn't press her. He didn't circle back to the conversation with leading questions or meaningful silences designed to nudge her toward a conclusion. He just worked alongside her the way he always had, and let the 3 days be what they were. On the first day, she thought about her mother. Her mother was a woman who had survived the loss of the land, the loss of her husband's confidence, 2 bad winters in a rented house, and a daughter who left without proper warning. And she had survived all of it without once pretending it wasn't happening. That was the thing about her mother that Maren had spent years taking for granted, and was only now starting to properly appreciate. She hadn't hidden from any of it. She'd just looked at each thing directly and figured out what came next. On the second day, Maren thought about what it actually meant to have Cain hold this over them. Not the abstract fear of it, but the practical reality. He would come back. He'd made that clear without saying it. And every time he came back, the conversation would have a price. A little more land, a little more ground conceded, a little more leverage surrendered. And the price would keep going up because that was how men like Cain operated. They didn't want a single payment. They wanted an arrangement. They wanted you to need them, not to do the thing they were threatening to do indefinitely, until needing them became the permanent condition of your life. Her father had needed someone like that once. She knew exactly how that story ended. On the third day, she went to the kitchen desk and opened the drawer and took out the bundle of letters. She sat at the table and untied the leather cord and went through them slowly, one by one, in order. She read her own words in the way you read things you've written when enough time has passed that they feel slightly foreign, recognizable but surprising, like a photograph of yourself taken when you weren't looking. She had written honestly. That was the thing she kept landing on. Every word she'd put on paper for Gideon Mercer had been genuinely hers, not performed, not calculated to impress, not shaped around what she thought a man in his position would want to hear. She'd written the way she thought when she was alone, which was the most honest version of herself she had access to. She'd just written it under the wrong name. She tied the letters back and put them in the drawer and went to find Gideon. He was at the barn, working through a harness repair that had needed doing for weeks. He looked up when she came in. "I think we tell the truth," she said, "before he does." He kept his hands on the harness. "You're sure?" "No," she said, "but I'm decided." He nodded once, slowly. "All right. When?" "Not yet. I want to know how much he actually has first." He set the harness down. "There's a difference between what he suspects and what he can prove. We need to understand which one we're dealing with before we figure out how to move." She thought about that. "How do we find out?" "I'm going to pay him a visit." She stared at him. "That's... Gideon, that's walking into his territory." "I know." "He'll think you're coming to negotiate." "Good." He picked up the harness again. "Let him think that." He rode out to Cain's ranch the following morning alone, which Maren didn't like but couldn't argue against with any logic that held. She watched him go from the porch and spent the morning doing the kind of work that kept her hands occupied without requiring much of her mind, which was the worst kind of work to be doing when her mind was running at full speed in the wrong direction. Cain's property was 12 miles east. Gideon was back by early afternoon. He came into the kitchen and poured himself water from the pitcher and drank half of it before he said anything. "He has a contact in Columbus," he said. "Someone who knew your family. Knows your sister's name, your name, the situation with the land your father lost." He set the cup down. "He has a letter from someone who put together who you are and what you're doing here." "A letter?" Maren looked at the table. "Saying what exactly?" "That Evelyn Ashcroft didn't board that train. That the woman who arrived in Blackstone Ridge is her younger sister, Maren Whitlock, and that the marriage arrangement she arrived under is fraudulent." The word landed with the weight it had been carrying since the beginning. "He showed you the letter?" she said. "He read me a portion of it." Gideon's jaw had the set to it that she'd learned to read as controlled anger rather than coldness. He was generous about the whole thing, seemed to think he was doing me a favor. What did he want? The creek access and 60 acres of the East Field. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. In exchange for which the letter disappears, he never heard the name Whitlock, and life goes on as normal. She absorbed this. 60 acres of the East Field. And the creek. That's the most valuable land you have. Yes, if you give him that, he has water access, which means eventually he has leverage over every rancher in the lower county who doesn't have their own water source. Yes, she looked at him. He's not just coming after you. He never was. Gideon leaned back in his chair. I'm the piece he needs to make the rest of it work. Once he has the creek, he has options. Right now he just has plans. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the wind had come up, and she could hear it moving through the eaves with the particular pitch it had in November, a long, low sound that her first week here had kept her awake, and now she barely noticed. What did you tell him? She asked. I told him I needed time to consult with my wife. A pause. He said the word without inflection, carefully. He gave me until Friday. That's 4 days. 3.5. She pressed her palms flat on the table. Gideon, we're not giving him the land. No, he said. We're not. Then we tell the truth first. On our terms. On our terms, he agreed. But I want to do it right. He looked at her directly. There's a county harvest gathering in 8 days. At the Halverson farm. Most of the families in the area will be there. Not just from town, from the outlying ranches too. If we're going to say it, that's where we say it. In front of everyone at once, rather than letting it spread by rumor. She felt the shape of that. Public, deliberate. No room for Cain to get ahead of the story. He'll be there, she said. He's always at the gathering. It's one of the few times a year when refusing to come would say something. Gideon's eyes were steady. He'll come expecting us to have made a decision about the land. Instead, he'll get something else entirely. And if people don't receive it well? He was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet. Some won't, he said. I told you that before and I'm telling you again. We may lose the goodwill of some families who decide the deception is more than they can overlook. Your reputation is mine to risk. He said it without force, just fact. It's not something you're doing to me. It's a decision I'm making. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something she'd been circling around for weeks, not letting herself land on, and she landed on it now. Why? She said. You could still send me back. Whatever Cain's letter says, there's no legal. There's nothing binding. You could send me back, find a real arrangement, start over. He'd have no reason to use the letter if there was nothing to use it against. Gideon looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not quite impatience, something closer to disbelief at the question itself. Because I don't want to, he said. Simple. Like it was the most obvious thing he'd said in months. She didn't say anything. Marin. He leaned forward slightly. I read those letters for 11 months. I know how you think. I know what you're afraid of and what you want and what you won't compromise on, even when it would be easier to. I knew all of that before you arrived. He stopped. And then you arrived. And you were exactly who those letters said you were. You were more. He looked at the table, then back at her. So no, I'm not interested in starting over. The kitchen was very quiet. That's the most you've said to me at once, she said, because she needed to say something, and that was the truest thing available. I'm aware. I won't forget it. I know you won't. He stood up. 3.5 days. We need to be ready. Ready meant different things over the next 3 days. It meant Gideon riding to 2 neighboring ranches, the Calloway place and the Hennessy operation, both families he trusted and both men who had history with Cain's expansion tactics, and having honest conversations about what was coming. Not asking for anything specifically, just telling the truth in advance to people who deserved to hear it from him rather than someone else. He came back from the Calloway ranch on the first evening looking tired in a specific way. How'd it go? Marin asked. Cal took it better than I expected. His wife asked about you. Gideon hung his coat. I told her you'd been managing the ranch through a November snowstorm, and that seemed to satisfy most of her questions. What kind of questions? Whether you were the kind of woman who'd pull her weight. He looked at her. I told her the truth. She felt something complicated at that. And the Hennessy's? Tomorrow. He sat down at the table. Ed Hennessy's been at odds with Kane for 2 years over grazing rights. He's going to be fine. A pause. I hope. She sat across from him. You're not certain. I'm almost never certain about people. He rubbed his face with one hand. That's what makes them worth thinking about. She understood what he meant. She'd thought about people her whole life for the same reason. They were unpredictable. Tension was what made it matter. I should be doing this with you, she said. You'll do it at the gathering. That's not what I mean. You're going to these men and explaining what happened on my behalf, and I'm sitting here. That's not... She stopped. I don't want to be explained. I want to explain myself. He looked at her for a moment. You're right, he said. Come with me to Hennessy's tomorrow. Thank you. I should have said it first. Yes, she agreed, without softening it. You should have. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to one she'd seen in days. Ed Hennessy was 60 years old, built like a man who had been made of the land itself, with a handshake that could have cracked stone and eyes that had a kind of weathered patience in them. His wife Ruth made coffee without being asked and sat at the table while Marin told the story, start to finish, without leaving anything out and without performing either guilt or defiance, just the facts and the reasons behind them. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Ruth Hennessy looked at her husband. He looked back at her. Your sister just left? Ruth said. Yes. Left you to handle the debts and the arrangement and everything else? Yes. Ruth looked at Marin with an expression that contained several things at once. That's a rotten thing for a sister to do, she said. It is, Marin said. But she had her reasons. I don't entirely disagree with them, even now. That seemed to matter to Ruth, the honesty of it, the refusal to make her sister purely a villain. She exchanged another look with her husband. Ed Hennessy set his coffee down. Kane came to me last spring, he said. Wanted the South grazing rights. When I told him no, 2 of my fences got cut inside of a month. Couldn't prove it was him. He looked at Gideon. You're going to tell the truth at the gathering? Yes. Before he gets to say his version. That's the plan. Hennessy was quiet for a moment. I'll be there, he said, and I'll bring my brother-in-law. He's been having trouble with Kane over a water easement. He looked at Marin. For what it's worth, Miss Whitlock, what you did took a certain kind of nerve. The wrong kind, but nerve nonetheless. A pause. What you're doing now takes the right kind. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said, Thank you, I think. He nodded. That seemed to be sufficient. Friday came and went without Kane receiving his answer. Saturday came and went. Marin watched the road and tried not to watch the road and did the work that needed doing, which was considerable because the ranch didn't pause for personal crisis. On Sunday, one of Kane's men appeared at the property line, not crossing it, just visible. Gideon looked at him from the yard and didn't change what he was doing. He's reminding you the deadline passed, Marin said. I know. He might do something. He might. You're not worried. I didn't say that. She looked at him. What are you worried about specifically? He looked back at the man at the fence line. That he'll do something before Tuesday, he said, before the gathering. If he moves first, even if he's wrong, the story starts with him. What kind of something? Anything. A complaint to the sheriff about the arrangement, a letter to a few well-placed people in town. He doesn't need to prove anything. Just create enough uncertainty that when I stand up at the Halverson farm, it looks like I'm playing defense. She thought about that. Then we move first. He looked at her. The gathering's 2 days away. I know, but we don't have to wait for the gathering to tell people the truth. We can tell them now. She watched the man at the fence line start to turn his horse. The Calloways, the Hennessys. Who else do you trust in this county? Truly trust? Enough to tell them before Tuesday. He counted. 4 families. Maybe 5. Then we ride tomorrow. He studied her for a moment. There was something in his face that she'd been seeing more frequently lately. Not admiration exactly, more like recognition. Like she was confirming something he'd already suspected. All right, he said. Tomorrow. They rode together to all 5 families over the course of Monday, a long, cold day that started before dawn and ended after dark. And Marin told the story 5 times in 5 different kitchens to 5 different sets of eyes. Each time she told it the same way, without editing it to make herself look better, or her sister look worse. And each time she said at the end, "We're telling you because you deserve to hear it from us first, and because we think what Bartholomew Kane has been doing to this county matters more than whatever mistakes I made when I arrived." Some received it better than others. The Brants were stiff about it, polite but cool, and Marin left their kitchen knowing they hadn't made an ally. The Wilder family was harder to read. Old Walt Wilder shook Gideon's hand without changing his expression, and his daughter-in-law watched Marin with eyes that could have meant anything. But the Peterson family, a young couple, newer to the area, still building their place, listened to the whole thing, and then Clara Peterson said, "Kane threatened us last month. Told Jonas there were questions about our title filing." Her husband looked at the floor. "There weren't any questions. He made them up." "Did you go to Sheriff Boone?" Gideon asked. "We didn't think he'd believe us over Kane." Clara looked at Marin. "Will you say that at the gathering? About the land fraud, the tactics?" "Yes," Marin said. "Then we'll be there." Clara reached across the table and briefly touched Marin's hand. Not a gesture of absolution. She wasn't offering that. Just contact, acknowledgement, the kind of thing that passed between people who understood that life was harder than it should be, and you got through it the way you got through it. They rode home in the dark, their horses moving together through cold air, a quarter moon giving just enough light to see by. "You did well today," Gideon said. "I told the truth repeatedly. It wasn't graceful." "No," he agreed, "but you didn't make it pretty. That's why they believed you." She thought about that for a while. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold. "Gideon," she said. What happens if Tuesday goes wrong?" He was quiet for a moment. The road curved and they followed it. "Then it goes wrong," he said, "and we figure out what comes next." "That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one." He glanced at her. "I've spent 7 years fighting Kane by planning 3 moves ahead. Sometimes that works. Sometimes something happens that wasn't in any of the plans and you just deal with it." He looked back at the road. "Whatever happens Tuesday, we'll deal with it." She rode with that for a while. It wasn't comforting, exactly, but it was true. Tuesday morning came in cold and clear. The sky, the particular hard blue of late autumn that had no sympathy in it. Marin woke before dawn without being able to sleep any further and lay in the dark listening to the ranch sounds. The particular creak of the house in morning cold, the distant sound of cattle, a single bird somewhere repeating itself. She got up. She dressed carefully, not formally. She didn't have much formal, and overdressing would have been its own kind of performance. But in the best of what she had, the dark wool dress she'd brought from Ohio, mended twice since she arrived and fitting her better now than it had off the stage because she'd taken it in at the sides. She pinned her hair up properly and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked like what she was. That would have to be enough. When she came out to the kitchen, Gideon was already at the stove. He looked at her when she came in and something passed over his face that was gone before she could read it clearly. "Breakfast," he said, and turned back to what he was doing. She sat at the table. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "Some." "Good." She folded her hands on the table. "I'd be worried if you weren't." He set a plate in front of her and sat across with his own. They ate without talking much. The food was plain and sufficient and real, and she focused on that. The physical fact of breakfast, the warmth of the kitchen, the ordinary morning that was about to become something other than ordinary. "Whatever happens today," she said when they were nearly done, "I want you to know that I understand what you're risking. For something that isn't. You didn't create this problem. I did." He looked at her. "I'm not saying it to be noble," she said. "I'm saying it because it's true, and because I don't want you to think I don't know it. I know you know it." He set his fork down. "Marin, when I go up in front of those people today, I'm not doing it as some kind of sacrifice. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do and because it's what I've decided." He held her gaze. "You don't owe me the suffering of feeling like a burden. That's not the arrangement I'm looking for." She sat with that for a moment. "What arrangement are you looking for?" she asked, quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll let you know," he said, "when we get through today." She nodded. She picked up her fork. Outside the window, the morning had fully arrived, pale and cold, and entirely indifferent to their plans. The Halverson farm was 6 miles out. The gathering started at noon. Kane would be there by noon, and he would arrive expecting one thing and encounter another. They washed the dishes. They hitched the wagon. Marin put on her coat and picked up the pair of gloves she'd bought in town on her first and so far only visit, still a little too large for her hands. Gideon came out of the barn and looked at the sky. "Clear," he said. "No weather coming." "That's something," she said. "That's something," he agreed. She climbed up to the wagon bench. He climbed up beside her. He gathered the reins and the horse moved, and they went out through the gate and onto the road, and neither of them looked back. 6 miles of cold air and pale sky. 6 miles of the most ordinary thing, 2 people in a wagon on a road going somewhere on a Tuesday morning. Marin held her hands folded in her lap and watched the land go past. She thought about all the things she'd been carrying since Ohio. She thought about how heavy they were and how accustomed she'd gotten to the weight. She thought about what it might feel like to put them down. The Halverson farm came into view around the last hill, smoke rising from the cookhouse, wagons already gathered along the fence. Voices drifting out, the sound of a community assembling itself, the particular noise of people who knew each other well enough to be easy together. Marin could see the Hennessy wagon. She could see the Petersons. She could see, at the far end of the line, the fine buggy with the good horse. Kane was already there. Gideon stopped the wagon and looked at it for a moment. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the crowd, at the gathering farm, at the man in the expensive coat who was already visible near the main house, already positioned to see them arrive, already watching. She thought about her mother, about courage being mostly just habit. "Yes," she said. He clicked the horse forward. They drove down toward the farm together, and the noise of the gathering rose up around them, and the thing that had been waiting in the future for weeks was finally, irrevocably, now. The Halvorsen farm sat in a natural hollow between 2 low hills, which meant that coming down the road toward it, you saw the whole of the gathering before you were part of it. The wagons arranged along the fence, the smoke from the cookhouse, the clusters of people in the yard moving between the barn and the main house with the ease of people who'd been doing this same gathering at the same farm for years. Marin took it all in from the wagon bench and felt the particular quality of dread that wasn't about fear of pain, but about the irreversibility of what was coming. Once they did this, they couldn't undo it. Whatever the crowd gave back, they'd have to live inside of it. Gideon pulled the wagon to a space along the fence and set the brake. He climbed down first and came around to her side, and she climbed down without taking his hand, not because she didn't want to, but because she needed to arrive on her own feet. He understood. He stepped back and let her land, and they walked toward the gathering together, not quite side by side, with a foot of cold air between them. People noticed them immediately. She felt it before she saw it. The slight shift in the quality of the noise, conversations adjusting, eyes moving toward the arriving wagon. Some of it was ordinary curiosity, the social mechanics of a community gathering. Some of it was something more specific. Word moved faster than wagons in a county this size, and they'd visited 5 families yesterday, and families talked to other families. Mercer. Tom Brandt stepped forward from a group near the barn. He was a tall man with a face that did most of its communication through the set of his jaw, and his jaw right now was doing something neutral, that was working hard to stay neutral. "Didn't know if we'd see you today." "We said we'd be here," Gideon said. Brandt's eyes moved to Marin with the careful deliberateness of a man who had made a judgment and was double-checking it against the actual person. She met his eyes directly and said nothing. "My wife's inside," Brandt said finally. "She made that apple cake you like." "I'll find her," Gideon said. They moved on. Marin let out a breath she hadn't planned to hold. "That was," she started. "Better than expected," Gideon said, quietly, without turning his head. "I was going to say ambiguous." For Brandt, that was warm. She filed that away. The cookhouse was a long, low building behind the main house, and the heat coming off it was the kind that reached out and took you by the shoulders after a cold ride. Inside, a half-dozen women were working around 2 big tables, and the smell of food and wood smoke and coffee was so immediate and real that Marin felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since breakfast. Ruth Hennessy was there, and she caught Marin's eye from across the room and nodded once, firmly, like punctuation on a decision already made. Clara Peterson was at the near table, slicing bread, and she looked up and said, "You came." "We came," Marin said. "Good." Clara went back to the bread. Jonas has been talking to Ed Hennessy all morning about the water easement situation. A pause. And some other things. Maren understood what she meant. The groundwork that had been laid yesterday was working, slowly, without them having to manage it directly. People were talking to people. Stories were connecting to other stories. Kane's pattern was becoming visible in the way patterns only became visible when enough people compared their experiences at the same time. She took off her coat and asked where she could be useful, and was handed a stack of plates. Kane found her before she found him. She was crossing the yard between the cookhouse and the main house, carrying the plates. When she nearly walked into him coming around the side of the barn, he stopped. She stopped, 2 feet between them. He looked, if anything, more self-satisfied than he had at the ranch. He was a man who believed the world organized itself around his patience, and he'd been patient about today, and now here they all were. "Miss Whitlock," he said pleasantly, using her real name. The first salvo, establishing that he had it, that he'd say it wherever he chose. "Mr. Kane." She kept her voice level and her hands steady on the plates. "I was hoping to find Gideon. I imagine a decision's been reached." "I imagine you'll find out shortly," she said, "if you'll excuse me." She walked past him. She felt his eyes on her back for the full length of the yard, and she did not change her pace or her posture until she was through the door of the main house, at which point she set the plates on the nearest surface and stood still for a moment, just breathing. Walt Wilder's daughter-in-law, a woman named June, was in the entryway hanging coats. She'd been part of the harder-to-read Wilder visit yesterday, and she looked at Maren now with an expression Maren couldn't entirely parse. "I saw him stop you," June said. "Yes. He did something similar to my husband 2 years ago." June straightened a coat on its hook with more force than the task required. "Stopped him outside the bank. Made sure people saw them talking. Made it look like Walt was doing business with him willingly." She looked at Maren. "He likes to make things look a certain way." "I know. What you said yesterday about your family's land, about how the man who took it worked." June looked at the hooks rather than at Maren. It sounded familiar. Maren waited. "Kane bought a note on a loan my father-in-law took out 8 years ago," June said. "Called it due on 60 days' notice in the middle of a drought year." She set her jaw. "We managed it, but barely." She finally looked at Maren directly. "Walt wasn't sure about coming today. I told him we were coming." "I'm glad," Maren said. June made a sound that might have been agreement and went back to the coats, and Maren took the information into the main room where the gathering was already organized into the loose constellation of a community that knew its own configurations. She found Gideon near the far wall in conversation with Ed Hennessy, and a man she didn't recognize, 50s, compact build, with the look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors and had the patience that came with it. Gideon saw her and brought her into the group without breaking the conversation. "This is Bill Cargill," he said. "His spread is north of ours. He and I haven't had enough occasion to talk." Cargill looked at her with an evaluating steadiness. "I know who you are," he said, not unkindly. "Heard some of it this morning, some of it last year when you first arrived." He paused. "My wife had a cousin who did something similar, different circumstances. She married out west under a name that wasn't quite hers." He looked at Gideon. "It's more common than people admit." "It's more common than it should need to be," Maren said. Cargill considered that. "Fair enough," he said. She scanned the room while they talked. Kane was near the door now, speaking to Sheriff Lyle Boone with the studied ease of a man having a casual conversation that wasn't casual at all. She watched Boone nod twice, slowly, with the expression of a man receiving information he wasn't sure what to do with. "He's already working on Boone," she said quietly to Gideon in a gap in the conversation. Gideon's eyes went to the door. "I see it. Does it change the timing?" "It might move it up." He looked at Hennessy. "Ed?" "I've been thinking the same thing," Hennessy said. "Before lunch rather than after." Cargill had caught up with the exchange. "I'll get my brother-in-law," he said, and moved off without further discussion. Maren looked at Gideon. "How do you want to do it?" "I'll speak first. You speak second." "You don't need to go first." "Yes, I do." He said it without drama. "It needs to come from me, then from you. That way it's not you defending yourself against an accusation. It's both of us choosing this together. She understood the structure of it. He was right about the structure. She still didn't entirely love that she needed him to go first, but she understood why the optics mattered, and she was too practical to let pride override effectiveness. All right, she said. When you speak, say everything. Don't leave the edges soft. He looked at her. People can tell when something's been edited, and the ones who are going to be on your side, they need the whole truth to stand behind, not a cleaned-up version. I know. I know you know. He touched her arm briefly, just a press of his hand above her elbow, and dropped it. 5 minutes. She nodded and went to find Ruth Hennessy. The gathering inside the main house numbered around 60 people by the time Gideon stepped away from the wall and into the center of the room. The noise didn't drop immediately. It took a moment, a ripple of awareness moving from the people nearest him outward, until the conversations fell away one by one, and the room organized itself around the fact that Gideon Mercer was standing where you stood when you had something to say. Marin was near the back. She could see Kane from where she stood, and she watched his face as Gideon began to speak. I want to say something to the people in this room, Gideon said. Not because I have to, because I'd rather say it myself than have it said for me. The room was almost entirely quiet now. Even the cookhouse noise seemed to have dampened. Most of you know that there's been a woman at my ranch since October. You know her as Evelyn Ashcroft, which is the name that came with the arrangement I made. He paused, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to seem uncertain. That's not her name. Her name is Marin Whitlock, and she's the younger sister of the woman who was originally supposed to make that journey. There was no collective gasp. It wasn't that kind of crowd, but a very specific quality of attention settled over the room. The attention of people who were recalibrating, who had just been handed a new piece and were already finding where it fit. The sister who was supposed to come decided not to, Gideon continued. She had her reasons. Marin had her own, among them the fact that travel debts had been incurred that needed addressing, and that a man across the country had been waiting, and she didn't think it was right to leave both of those things unresolved. He didn't look at Kane. He looked at the room. I knew when she arrived, he said. Not from anything she did wrong, from 11 months of reading her letters, which she wrote. Not her sister. Her. I recognized the person from the letters and the person who stepped off that stage, and I understood what had happened, and I made a decision not to create a scene about it in public. He let that settle. I don't regret that decision. What I regret is that we've been carrying the shape of it around for 2 months, and that ends today. He turned then, slightly, toward where Marin stood in the back of the room, and 60 pairs of eyes followed his. She came forward. She hadn't planned the walk carefully. There wasn't a way to plan that kind of walk. So she just walked, the way she'd walked toward the barn in snowstorms, and toward uncomfortable conversations, and toward things she couldn't avoid. She stopped next to Gideon and looked at the room. Up close, it was harder. She could see individual faces now, the Brants near the left wall, Tom's jaw doing its neutral working hard thing, the Petersons near the door, Clara holding Jonas's arm, Ruth Hennessy watching her with something steady and encouraging, Walt Wilder in the back with his arms crossed, expression unreadable, Sheriff Boone with his weight shifted back on his heels, listening, Kane, near the window, watching her with an expression she had not expected. He looked amused. It had the quality of someone watching a maneuver they hadn't anticipated and hadn't fully calculated yet. She made herself look away from him. My name is Marin Whitlock, she said. I'm from Ohio. My family had land there until a man convinced my father to sign over the mineral rights through a contract my father didn't fully understand. After that, a lot of things got harder. She kept her voice even. When my sister arranged to come west, she asked me to help with the letters. She struggled to say what she wanted to say on paper. I helped until I was doing it entirely on my own, which happened by the 4th letter. She looked at the room. I want to be clear about what that means. The man standing next to me spent 11 months corresponding with someone he believed was Evelyn Ashcroft. Every word in those letters was mine. My thoughts, my questions, my honest opinions about things. Not performed for an audience, not calculated to be appealing. I didn't know him. I was just answering him honestly. She paused. When my sister left and I realized what would happen if no one came, I made a choice I knew was wrong, and I made it anyway. I'm not here to make that sound better than it was. A woman near the center of the room, Marin didn't know her name, shifted her weight. Someone near the door coughed. "I'm here," Marin said, "because Bartholomew Kane knows who I am, and he came to this ranch and offered to keep the information quiet in exchange for Gideon's Creek access and 60 acres of the East Field." The room changed. It was subtle and it was unmistakable. The weight of attention shifted, redistributed, found a new point. "He came to us," Marin said, "because he thought he had something we needed to hide. He was right. We were hiding it." She looked directly at Kane for the first time. "We're not hiding it anymore." Kane's amusement was gone, not replaced by anger. He was too controlled for visible anger in a room this size, but the pleasant surface had thinned and underneath it was something harder and colder. "That's a serious accusation," Kane said from where he stood. "Yes," Marin said, "it is." "I'd be careful about making accusations you can't." "He showed you a letter," Gideon said, cutting across Kane's sentence without raising his voice. He was looking at the room, not at Kane. A letter from a contact in Columbus who had identified Marin and documented her background. "He read me a portion of it on Friday morning in his house and told me I had until Friday evening to agree to his terms." He paused. The terms were the creek access and 60 acres, for his silence. The room was very quiet now. "Several of you," Gideon said, "have had your own encounters with Mr. Kane's business practices. Some of you may have thought you were the only one. You're not." Ed Hennessy's voice came from somewhere to the left. "He cut my fences twice," he said. Not loudly, just clearly. "After I turned down his offer on the South grazing rights." Jonas Peterson, after a short pause. "He had someone file a false question about our title with the county recorder. Took us 4 months to clear it." A voice from the back Marin didn't recognize. "He bought the note on my father-in-law's loan and called it due in 60 days. Drought year." Kane turned toward the room. "These are rumors and grievances from men who couldn't manage their own—" "Bill Cargill." The compact man from earlier stepped forward. "My name is Bill Cargill, and I've got the receipts from the note Kane's man bought on my neighbor's property, along with the timeline of the call and the letter that came with it." He looked at Kane. "I've been holding on to them for 2 years, waiting for the right occasion." The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. This one had weight to it, the weight of a room full of people arriving at the same conclusion at the same moment. Kane looked around the room. He was a man who had operated for a long time on the understanding that individual people, alone, were manageable. You found their pressure points. You applied pressure. You got what you wanted, or you made their situation complicated enough that not cooperating became more expensive than cooperating. It was a system that worked on individuals. It didn't work as well on rooms. "This is a gathering of neighbors," Kane said. His voice had shifted, still controlled, but the pleasantness was entirely gone now. "Not a court of law. Whatever grievances people in this room believe they have Sheriff Boone," Gideon said. Everyone looked at Lyle Boone. Boone was a careful man. He'd been sheriff of this county for 11 years by being a careful man. Not timid, not corrupt, but genuinely careful about the difference between things he could act on and things he couldn't. He'd been building a picture of Kane's operations for the better part of 3 years, and what he'd mostly been missing was people willing to say things in front of other people. People were not, in his experience, willing to do that. He straightened up from the wall. "Mr. Cargill," he said, "I'd like to see those receipts." Cargill nodded. "I'll bring them to your office Monday." "I'll be there." Boone looked at the room. "Anyone else who has documentation of encounters with Mr. Kane's representatives, title disputes, note purchases, fence incidents? I'd like to speak with you as well, individually, this week, if possible." He didn't look at Kane when he said this. He didn't need to. Kane looked around the room one more time. I was reassessing. She could see it, the rapid, quiet calculation of a man who had come to this gathering with one plan and was now standing in the wreckage of it, working out what was salvageable. He found her eyes across the room, and she looked back at him without flinching, and whatever he was calculating, he arrived at the conclusion without showing his work. He picked up his coat from the hook by the door. "I'll have my lawyers contact yours," he said to Gideon formally, like the room wasn't full of witnesses. "That'll be fine," Gideon said. Kane left. The door didn't slam. He controlled it on the way out, which was somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. The sound of his buggy leaving the yard reached them a minute later. The room breathed. Tom Brandt was the first one to speak. "Gideon," he said, with the economy of a man who found most communication inefficient. "Whatever you need." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't a parade. It was a rancher from a neighboring property saying in the fewest possible words, "I'm in." Coming from Tom Brandt, it meant more than a speech would have. Gideon nodded. "Appreciate it, Tom." Ruth Hennessy came through the cookhouse door at that point, apparently having been updated through some relay system Marin hadn't tracked, and she looked at the room and then at Marin with an expression that said she'd heard enough. "The food's ready," she announced, with the authority of a woman who understood that communities process difficult things best when their hands were occupied. "And I'm not letting it go cold because of Bartholomew Kane." The room moved. People reorganized. Conversations started up again in the new configuration that had been created by the last 20 minutes. Quieter in some places, more intense in others. The specific hum of a community recalculating its own understanding. Marin stood in the middle of it and tried to figure out what she felt. Not relief. It was too early for relief, and too much was still unresolved. Not triumph. That word had never fit her well, and especially didn't fit this. Something more complicated and less clean. The feeling of having done a hard thing and not yet knowing what it cost. Clara Peterson came up beside her. "You're still standing," she said. "Apparently. That's more than I expected to be doing, the week after we told our story to anyone who'd listen." Clara looked at the room. "It gets not easier exactly, but more possible." Marin looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for Monday, for being honest about the title situation." "You made it easier," Clara said, "hearing someone say the thing plainly. It makes you think maybe you can too." She paused. "My mother used to say that shame needed a dark room to live in. You take away the dark room, it doesn't know what to do with itself." Marin thought about that. Her mother would have had a similar opinion, phrased differently. What? The afternoon passed in the strange, suspended way of time after something significant, slow and fast by turns, full of small conversations that each carried more freight than they appeared to. The Wilder family ate supper near them, and Walt Wilder said nothing about anything that had happened but passed the bread to Marin with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement. June Wilder told her about the loan situation in more detail than she had in the entryway, and Marin listened fully and said she was sorry it had happened and meant it. Sheriff Boone found her near the end of the meal. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I'm asking as a neighbor rather than as sheriff." He settled into the chair across from her. "The arrangement you arrived under, the deception. I understand the reasons. That's not what I'm asking about." He looked at his coffee. "The letter Kane has, from the Columbus contact, is the information in it accurate?" "Yes," she said. "All of it?" "I haven't seen the letter, but anything Kane could have found out from someone who knew my family in Ohio would be accurate, yes. There's nothing I've been concealing that isn't exactly what it appears to be." Boone nodded. "That's what I thought." He looked at her. "For what it's worth, Miss Whitlock, impersonating someone in a private arrangement, taking a position intended for another person, is a civil matter, not a criminal one, in most cases. And in this case, with no fraud intended for financial gain, and with Gideon Mercer not making any complaint." He stopped. "I don't see any action that comes from my office in your direction." She hadn't been expecting that specific conversation. She'd been so focused on the Kane situation that the legal dimension of her own position had been somewhere at the back of her mind since October, present, but not primary. "Thank you," she said. "I'm telling you because you should know it," he said. "Not as a favor." He stood up. "I'd appreciate it if you'd be available to make a statement this week about Kane's visit to the ranch, the terms he offered, the timeline." "Of course." He tipped his head and moved off. She sat for a moment with the particular quality of a weight she hadn't known she was carrying becoming suddenly lighter. Not gone. She didn't expect it to be gone, but lighter. Gideon found her a few minutes later. He sat down across from her with 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her without asking, and looked at her with an expression that was hard to characterize but easy to understand. "You did well," he said. "We did well," she said. He considered arguing the distinction and apparently decided against it. "Boone talked to you." "Yes." "And?" And the civil versus criminal distinction is apparently meaningful. She wrapped her hands around the cup. He wants a statement about Kane. I told him the same. Monday. He looked at the table. Kane's lawyers are going to make noise. That part isn't over. I know. The land dispute will probably go into the county process. Months of paperwork, maybe longer. He looked up. I want you to understand that before we... He stopped. She looked at him. Before we what? He looked at the table again, which was about as close as Gideon Mercer came to looking uncertain. Before we talk about what happens next, he said. Between you and me. Specifically. The cookhouse noise filled the space between them, the comfortable roar of a community that had survived its afternoon and was now eating pie and arguing about fence prices, the way it always argued about fence prices. I'm not going anywhere, she said, if that's part of the question. He looked at her. I mean that as a statement, she said, not as a guarantee of anything specific. I'm telling you, I don't have anywhere else to be and I don't want to be anywhere else. She was aware she was navigating something carefully and not entirely gracefully. Whatever we decide this is, formally, that's a separate question. It is, he agreed, but not a question I want to leave open forever. No, she said. Neither do I. They sat with that across from each other for a moment, two people who were not good at imprecision having a careful, imprecise conversation. There's a justice of the peace in town, he said finally. Fielding. He does things quietly. She looked at him. Are you asking me something, Gideon? He met her eyes. I'm working up to it, he said. She felt something that was not quite a laugh press against the inside of her chest. Take your time, she said. I was thinking December. He set it to the table. The paperwork with Kane will still be ongoing. It won't be a clean moment. I don't need a clean moment. He looked up. No, I don't suppose you do. Outside the window. The late afternoon light had gone the color of something old and good, the particular gold that happened at this latitude in November when the angle was right. Inside, Ruth Hennessy had started clearing plates with the organized efficiency of a woman who had been feeding communities for 30 years. Clara Peterson was laughing at something Jonas had said. Walt Wilder was telling a story to Bill Cargill that involved a lot of gesturing. Marin looked at all of it and thought about how 3 months ago she had stepped off a stage with a leather case and a borrowed name, and so much fear compressed into so small a space that she'd needed both hands to hold it. She thought about how this room felt right now. Not like safety. She'd learned not to trust the word safe as a permanent condition, but like something real. Like something that had been built out of honest materials and would hold. December, she said. Gideon looked at her. December's good, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and she picked up hers, and they sat together in the noise of the Halverson farm, in the middle of everything that was still unresolved and everything that had just shifted, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it right then. That was also, she was beginning to understand, a kind of answer. The drive home from the Halverson farm took longer than the drive out, because the dark came in fast and Gideon held the horse to a careful pace on the road. Neither of them talked much. The silence was different from the silences they'd shared before, not the careful silence of two people managing around each other. Not the tense quiet of people holding something difficult. It was the silence of people who had used up a lot of words on important things and now didn't need any for a while. Marin sat with her hands in her lap and watched the dark land go past and thought about the faces in that room, the ones that had shifted, the ones that hadn't. She was honest enough with herself to hold both without resolving the uncomfortable ones into something more flattering. The Brants had helped pass dishes after Kane left, and Tom Brant had said whatever you need in that clipped, self-contained way of his. That was real. But she'd also caught the look on his wife's face when she thought no one was watching. Not hostility, something more conflicted than that. And Marin knew that whatever you need from Tom Brant and the complete trust of his wife were different things, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. That was the part no one told you about telling the truth publicly. It didn't resolve everything into clarity. It just changed the shape of what remained unresolved. The uncertainty moved from when will this come out to how will people carry it. And the second kind of uncertainty was slower and less dramatic and, in some ways, harder to live inside of. You're thinking, Gideon said. Hmm. The Brant situation. She looked at him in the dark. How did you? Because I know how you work. He kept his eyes on the road. You went through every face in that room and you landed on the ones that weren't entirely clear. His wife. Margaret Brant is careful about who she extends herself toward. She's not unfriendly. She's careful. He paused. She'll make up her own mind. Nothing we do will speed it up. I know. And it might not go our way. I know that too. Marin turned back to the dark road ahead. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm just thinking about it. He nodded. That was enough. They got home past 8, unhitched the horse, settled the animals, and came into a house that was exactly as they'd left it. The breakfast dishes still drying, the kitchen cold, the lamp waiting to be lit. Marin got the stove going while Gideon lit the lamp, and they moved around each other in the small kitchen with the ease of people who'd learned each other's patterns, who knew, without negotiating, whose hands went where. She heated the leftover coffee, and they drank it at the table. I want to write to my mother, she said. He looked at her. Not tonight, but soon. She held the cup in both hands. She doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I went to stay with a cousin in Pennsylvania after Evelyn left. I lied to her too. She looked at the table. I've been composing the letter in my head for 2 months. What's it say? Different things, depending on the day. She considered. Mostly it says I'm sorry I didn't tell her the truth from the beginning, and then it tells the truth. How will she take it? Badly, at first. Marin almost smiled. My mother's first response to most surprises is anger. Then she thinks about it for 2 days and comes to a more considered position. She looked up. She'll be relieved I'm settled somewhere. She'll be furious at Evelyn, which she's probably already partly furious at Evelyn for disappearing to Cincinnati without proper explanation. A pause. She'll want to know what you're like. What will you tell her? She looked at him across the table, at this man who had picked up her leather case on a dusty platform and carried it to his wagon and given her the space to become herself without once forcing the pace, who had read 11 months of her most honest thinking and valued it before he'd ever seen her face, who had put himself in front of a room full of people and told the truth because it was the right thing to do, and who had done it without making her feel like it was a sacrifice she owed him for. He was not a perfect man. He was stubborn in specific ways that would be genuinely irritating over time. He was not easy to know. He had a tendency to solve problems in his head before telling her he was solving them, which was something she was going to have to address directly and probably more than once. He went too long without sleeping when something was worrying him and then was short-tempered the next day, and he knew it about himself and didn't always catch it in time. She knew all of this, and it didn't alter the basic fact. I'll tell her you're worth the trouble, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. He didn't smile easily enough for it to be a smile, but something that lived in the same country. That's a low bar, he said. My mother has a realistic view of people, Marin said. She'll understand what I mean. He set down his cup, looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. December, he said, again. The same word from the same conversation, but it landed differently in this kitchen, in this late-night quiet, than it had at the Halverson farm. December, she said. He nodded. And that was the entirety of a conversation that was also, in its own quiet and unceremonious way, the most important one they'd had. The weeks between the gathering and December were not simple. Kane's lawyers sent a letter that arrived on a Thursday, formal and precise, making no explicit threats but containing language that was structured to imply them. Gideon read it, set it on the desk, and wrote back the following day with the help of his own lawyer in town, a dry, meticulous man named Arthur Foss, who had been waiting for years, it seemed, for exactly this kind of correspondence. Kane overplayed his hand at the gathering, Foss said, when Gideon brought Marin with him to the office to give her statement to Boone, who worked out of the same building on alternating days. He's used to operating in private, individual negotiations, private pressure. The moment he became the subject of a public conversation with multiple witnesses, his leverage changed fundamentally. He still has the letter, Marin said. He has a letter, Foss said, that describes a private arrangement between 2 adults, neither of whom is disputing the facts of it, and both of whom are cooperating with county authorities regarding a separate and more serious matter. He looked at her over his spectacles. The letter has considerably less utility now than it did 3 weeks ago. Boone took her statement on the same morning, in a small room at the back of the building with a window that looked out at the livery yard. He was thorough and patient, and when she was finished, he said that 3 other families had already come in, and he expected more. "What happens to Kane?" she asked. "That depends on what we can document and what the county prosecutor decides to do with it." He folded his notes. "I won't make you promises I can't keep, Miss Whitlock. What I'll tell you is that the pattern of behavior, across multiple properties and multiple years, is the kind of thing that tends to get addressed when it becomes visible. Kane has been invisible a long time." He looked at her steadily. "He's not invisible anymore." It wasn't a guarantee. She hadn't asked for one, but it was honest, and she'd take that. Sheriff Boone proved to be as good as his word in the way that careful men often are. Not dramatic about it, not fast, but thorough. By the end of November, he had statements from 7 families, documentation of 2 fraudulent title challenges, and evidence that the note Kane had purchased on Walt Wilder's father-in-law's loan had been bought through a third party specifically to obscure Kane's involvement. The county prosecutor, a businesslike woman named Hargrove, who had been waiting for solid ground to stand on, began formal proceedings in early December. Kane did not come back to the ranch. His men stayed off the fence line. The supply arrangements that had been complicated by his stake in Deacon Fry's store were restored when Fry, apparently deciding which way the wind was turning, quietly renegotiated the stake back to a minority position and sent Gideon a letter of apology that was exactly as awkward as such letters tended to be. Gideon wrote back, accepting it in 2 sentences. "You could have made him sweat more," Marin said, reading over his shoulder. "I could have," he agreed. "But Fry isn't Kane. He's just a man who made a bad business decision when Kane had more power than he has now." He folded the letter. "I want the county working normally. That's more useful than making Deacon Fry uncomfortable." She thought about that. It was one of those moments when she saw clearly the way Gideon's mind worked. Practical not in the sense of cold, but in the sense of always keeping the actual goal in front of him rather than the satisfactions that lived along the way. It was a quality she respected and would probably argue with regularly for the foreseeable future. She was okay with that. The wedding happened on a Wednesday in the second week of December, in the front room of Justice Fielding's house in town. Fielding was a small, white-haired man who had been doing civil ceremonies for 30 years and had developed the manner of someone who understood that what people needed from a wedding was not theatrics but clarity. He asked the necessary questions in a direct, unhurried voice, and they answered them, and he wrote the names, Gideon Allen Mercer and Marin Louise Whitlock, in the county register in a hand that was better than his age suggested. Ruth Hennessy was there because Marin had asked her. Ed Hennessy stood in the back with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who found ceremonies unnecessary, but had come because his wife said they were going, and that was the end of the discussion. Clara and Jonas Peterson came because Clara had found out about it through Ruth, and shown up at the ranch 2 days before to inform Marin that she was attending, which was not phrased as a request. The Brants were not there. Marin had not expected them to be. After, there was food at the Hennessy's place. Ruth had organized this independently, without consulting anyone, and presented it as a fact when they arrived. The table was loaded in the way of a woman who expressed most of her serious feelings through the preparation of food, and the evening was warm and loud enough and real. At some point, Gideon found himself in a conversation with Ed Hennessy about cattle prices that lasted 40 minutes. And Marin sat with Clara and Ruth and drank coffee and talked about things that had nothing to do with Kane or gathering or legal proceedings. And it was the best part of the evening for exactly that reason. Walking to the wagon at the end of the night, Gideon said, "Ruth outdid herself." "Ruth outdid a banquet hall," Marin said. "Don't tell her that. She'll just do more." Marin looked at him sideways. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It's an observation." She thought about taking his arm and then did it, and he looked down at her hand on his arm with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Slightly startled, then not, then something that settled into something she didn't have a word for but recognized as the right word's neighborhood. They drove home. The night was cold and clear, and the stars out here were the kind you couldn't see from a city, the kind that made you understand why people before telescopes had felt the need to name all of them. "Marin Mercer," she said, trying it out. He was quiet for a moment. "Does it fit?" She considered it. Better than the last name I was using, she said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. The letter to her mother went out the first week of January. She'd written 7 drafts, which was more than she'd written of any letter since. She stopped that thought before it completed. She wrote the final version without looking at the drafts, just sat down and told the truth in order, the way she'd told it at the gathering. The reasons, the mistakes, the outcome. She wrote about Gideon in 2 paragraphs: who he was, how he worked, what he'd done at the gathering, and why. She wrote, "I know this is not the news you expected, and I know you'll be angry first. I think you have the right to be. I also think that when you're done being angry, you'll understand why I made the choices I made, even if you would have made different ones. I hope you'll write back." She did not write, "Please forgive me." Not because she didn't feel it, but because her mother was not a woman who responded to that kind of appeal. Her mother responded to honesty, and to demonstration, and to time. She sealed the envelope and gave it to Gideon to add to the mail he was taking into town. He turned it over in his hands, looked at the address. "Ohio," he said. "Ohio," she confirmed. He put it in his coat pocket without saying anything else. She watched him go out to the wagon and thought about the letter traveling east. Weeks by the time it arrived, weeks more before anything came back. A long silence in which her mother would think and feel and arrive at her own conclusions. Maren couldn't control any of it. She'd said what was true and sent it into the world, and what came back would come back. That was, she supposed, the arrangement with most things. Winter settled in properly after Christmas, the kind of winter that required daily work to survive rather than endure. The ranch demanded everything the season demanded, and they gave it, together, with the occasional argument about how a thing should be done, and the occasional agreement that surprised them both by arriving without argument. She was right about the telling him things problem. He had a habit, she'd named it to herself by February, of working through a problem entirely in his head and then presenting her with the conclusion without the reasoning, which felt less like confidence sharing and more like receiving an edict from someone who'd already held the trial without her. The first time she said this to him directly, he was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd miscalculated. Then he said, "That's fair." "I know it is," she said. "I'm not asking you to change how you think. I'm asking you to let me into it earlier." "I'll try," he said. And then after a pause, I've been solving things alone for a long time. I don't mean to exclude you." "I know you don't mean to." She looked at him. "That's why I said it. If you meant to, I'd be having a different conversation." He looked at her with that expression that had become familiar, the recalibrating one, the one that said she'd confirmed something. "You'd have packed already," he said. "I'd have packed before winter," she agreed. He almost smiled. "Good to know the standard." "Always useful," she said. It didn't fix everything immediately because nothing fixed everything immediately. He forgot twice in February. She told him both times. The third time he stopped himself mid-decision and said, "I'm thinking through the Eastfield drainage issue. Do you want to hear where I am?" And she said yes, and they worked through it at the table and arrived at a better solution than the one he'd been heading toward alone, and neither of them mentioned what that represented. They just moved on to the next thing. That was how it worked. Not grand moments of transformation, but small repeated adjustments, the way you adjusted a fence post, a little at a time, checking the level, doing it again. The letter from her mother arrived in March. Maren was at the barn when Gideon came back from town. She heard the wagon and came out, and he had the mail in his hand, and she could see from the shape of his face, not a readable expression, just a quality of careful attention, that something from Ohio had come. He handed it to her without comment. She looked at the handwriting on the envelope. Her mother's hand, which had changed over the years from fluid to careful, the care of someone whose hands had done too much hard work. She turned the envelope over. "I'll be inside," Gideon said, and went to unhitch the horse. She sat on the bench outside the barn and opened the letter. Her mother had written 4 pages. The first page was anger, precise and specific. Not wild anger, not the kind that said things it didn't mean, but the controlled, articulate anger of a woman who had been frightened and had converted the fear into something she could direct. She was angry that Maren had lied. She said so plainly, twice, and she didn't soften it. The second page was grief, of a different sort. Her mother wrote about the day Evelyn had left for Cincinnati, which Maren hadn't known the details of. She wrote about arriving home to a note on the table in a house that felt both emptier and less complicated than it had been, which was its own kind of terrible. She wrote, "I knew something else was happening that I wasn't being told. I knew, and I let myself not ask because I was too tired to hold another thing. I regret that." The third page was questions. Practical ones, the kind her mother defaulted to when she was processing. How was the ranch situated financially? Was the land solid? Had the legal situation with the man Marin mentioned been addressed? What was the winter like? The fourth page was short. "I would like to see where you've landed. If the spring travel is manageable, and if your husband is agreeable, I would consider making the journey west. I have nothing holding me in Ohio that matters more than seeing my daughter settled in the place she's decided is her life. Write back and tell me when." Marin read the fourth page twice. She sat on the bench for a while after that, in the cold March sun, holding the letter in both hands. Above the barn, a hawk was working the updraft off the ridge line. She didn't know if it was the same hawk she'd watched that first evening or a different one, and it didn't matter. It moved the same way, with that effortless patience of something that had learned to use what the world gave it. Gideon came around from the other side of the barn and stopped when he saw her face. "Good or bad?" he said. "Both," she said. "Mostly good." She folded the letter carefully. "She wants to come in the spring." He was quiet for a moment, processing. "The guest room needs the window fixed," he said. She looked at him. "That's your response?" "I'm being practical." "Gideon." He looked at her with the expression that had become, over these months, the one she associated with the version of him that allowed himself to feel things without armoring them first. "She's your mother," he said. "Of course she should come." A pause. "I'll fix the window." Marin looked at the letter in her hands, and then at the ridgeline, and then at the man standing in front of her, who had built his whole life around this piece of land and these animals, and the solitary work of keeping it all together, and who was now talking about fixing a window in the guest room for a woman he'd never met because she was family now, which meant she was part of what he protected. "Thank you," she said. "It's a window," he said, and went back to the barn. Checked. Spring came in the way it came out here, fast and green, and more insistent than Ohio's version, like it had somewhere to be. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and the cattle moved to the south pasture, and the cottonwoods put out their leaves in that particular yellow-green that lasted about a week before deepening. Marin worked through every morning of it, and found that the land had gotten into her the way land did when you stopped treating it like a place you were staying and started treating it like a place you lived. The legal proceedings against Kane moved through the county process with the grinding inevitability of a system doing its job correctly, if not quickly. By April, 2 of the fraudulent title challenges had been formally voided. The prosecutor had filed on the note-calling scheme. Kane had retained 3 lawyers and stopped making any direct contact with anyone in the county, which Boone said was exactly what a man did when his lawyers told him to stop creating new witnesses. "He's not done," Gideon said one evening over supper. It was matter of fact, not worried. "No," Marin agreed, "but he's different than he was. He's operating on defense. That changes how much room he has. It also changes what he's willing to do," she said. "Cornered men do things that aren't in their plan." Gideon looked at her. "You think he'll try something?" "I think he might, but I also think he knows now that whatever he tries, there are people in this county who'll see it for what it is." She picked up her fork. "He lost the advantage of being the only story in the room. That's harder to get back than land." He considered this. "Your mother arrives next week," he said, after a pause that was a transition between subjects rather than an interruption. "Tuesday. I fixed the window." "I know, I checked it." He looked at her with the expression that meant she'd done something that confirmed something. And it's fine, better than it was." She met his eyes. "I'm not going to tell you every time you do something right, but the window is good." "I'm not looking for—" "I know you're not." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you anyway." He went back to his supper, but something had settled in the room that was the same kind of thing as the window. Small, right, real. Her mother arrived on a Tuesday in late April, off the stage with a single trunk and the expression of a woman who had been traveling for 2 weeks and had formed firm opinions about the stagecoach line. She was 61 years old and looked like someone who had earned every year of it. Not soft, not fragile, but the way certain things get when they've been tested and have not broken. Her eyes, when they landed on Marin, went through several things in quick succession that she didn't try to hide, and she crossed the platform and held her daughter for a long moment without saying anything. Then she stepped back and looked at Gideon. He was standing back, hat in his hands, giving them space. He met her eyes when she looked at him, directly, the way he met everyone's eyes. Her mother looked at him for a long moment. "You're taller than I expected," she said. "I get that," he said. "Marin said you were worth the trouble." "That's a low bar." Something almost surprised moved across her mother's face. She hadn't expected the self-awareness. She hadn't expected that particular dryness. She said, which Marin knew was her mother's sound for "I'm adjusting my assessment." Then she turned to the trunk and said, "Someone help me with this." And Gideon picked it up without being asked, and they walked to the wagon together. And that was the beginning of her mother and her husband learning each other, which was going to be its own long and imperfect and ultimately real process. Her mother stayed 6 weeks. She and Gideon were not always easy together. She had the sharpness of a woman who had been managing alone for years and was not inclined to defer to anyone without reason. And he had the stubbornness of a man who had made all his own decisions for a long time. They agreed about the practical things. The drainage issue in the East Field that Marin and Gideon had addressed in February. Her mother looked at it and said they'd done it right, which from her was the equivalent of a standing ovation, and disagreed about other things with the specific friction of people who were too similar in certain ways to always let the other be right. Marin watched them across the supper table one evening arguing about the best approach to a fence post problem, both of them wrong in interesting ways, and felt something she recognized as happiness, which was not the same as everything being resolved. It was something quieter and more durable than that. Her mother came to her room one evening near the end of the visit and sat on the edge of the bed the way she'd sat on the edge of Marin's bed in Ohio when Marin was a girl, and they'd needed to talk about something real. "I was angry," her mother said, "when I read your letter." "I know." "I was angry at you for lying, and angry at myself for not seeing it, and angry at Evelyn for—" She stopped. "For everything. Mama. She should have told me." Her mother's jaw set. "What she was planning. She should have said." "Yes," Marin said. "She should have. But you also should have told me what you were doing." "Yes," Marin said again. "I should have." Her mother looked at her hands. The same hands Marin had gotten, the same shape, worn differently. "You were protecting me," she said, "from having to know about the debts, about the shame of Evelyn leaving. You were trying to handle it so I didn't have to." "Yes." "I didn't ask you to do that." "No, I just did it." Her mother looked at her. "You've been doing that since you were 12, she said, "picking up what dropped before I saw it fall." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm grateful for it, and I also wish you'd let some of it hit the floor. It would have been all right." Marin felt the back of her throat do something she didn't particularly want it to do. "I know," she said, when she could say it steadily. "I'm working on that." "Gideon," her mother said, the word like a period, like a conclusion. "He doesn't let me pick up everything," Marin said. "He's better at the distribution than I expected." "He's a sensible man," her mother said, which from her was not faint praise. "Difficult in specific ways." "Yes." "So are you." "Yes." Her mother reached out and squeezed her hand once, the brief firm press of a woman who had never been easy with sentiment but knew how to deliver it when it mattered. Then she let go and stood up and said she was going to bed, because the ranch started early and she was not going to be the last one up. Marin sat on the bed after she left and held the feeling of the conversation, which was messy and incomplete in the way honest conversations between people with history always were. Not resolved into a single clean emotion. Multiple things at once, the way life was. She was working on that too. Her mother left in early June, and the day she drove away from the ranch in the wagon back to town was the kind of day that didn't need to be dramatized. They said goodbye at the stage, and her mother held her again, briefer this time, and shook Gideon's hand with both of hers, which he looked slightly startled by, and then she climbed up and was gone. Marin stood on the platform until the stage was around the bend. "She'll come back," Gideon said. "She will," Marin agreed. "Probably next spring." Probably. He put his hand on her back briefly, then dropped it. You want to go home? She turned away from the empty road and looked at him, and behind him the main street of Blackstone Ridge in early summer, the ordinary and continuing life of a place that was hers now. In the way places became yours, not through documents, though there were documents, but through the slow accumulation of mornings and arguments and work and dinners and small repairs and the knowledge of which boards creaked and which animals needed patience and where the light fell in the kitchen at noon. She thought about the platform where she'd arrived 8 months ago now, with a leather case and a borrowed name and a fear so large she'd had to make herself walk forward rather than back. She thought about a man picking up that case without being asked and saying, "You hungry?" and turning toward the wagon as though the complicated thing he'd just understood didn't require any immediate resolution. She thought about 11 months of letters, her own words traveling west in her sister's name, finding someone who had read them carefully enough to know them as hers before she ever arrived. She'd written the truth about herself to a stranger for nearly a year and sent it into the world not knowing what it would come back as, and what it had come back as was this. Not perfect, not without cost, not without the things that still needed working through, the ongoing legal process, the families that hadn't yet come around, the letters she still owed to Evelyn wherever Evelyn was, the work of a marriage that was real and therefore required real tending. But this. Yes, she said. Let's go home. They walked to the wagon. He climbed up and she climbed up, and he gathered the reins and the horse moved, and they went out of town and onto the road that led back to the ranch and the creek and the cottonwoods and all the ordinary hours of a life that was honestly, finally, theirs. The land opened up around them the way it always did on that stretch of road, wide and ongoing and indifferent to human arrangements, just sitting there being itself in the summer light. She'd thought it was too big when she first saw it. She'd thought there was something frightening about land that didn't tell you where it ended. She didn't think that anymore. She thought it was honest. It showed you exactly what it was, without decoration, and you either learned to live inside of it or you didn't. She'd learned. She thought about something she'd written in a letter once, one of the early ones, when she'd still been helping her sister and hadn't yet realized she'd stopped helping and started just writing. She'd written, "I think the bravest thing a person can do is tell the truth about themselves to someone who hasn't decided yet what to do with it." She hadn't known then who she was really writing to. She knew now. The wagon moved through the summer morning, and the ridge rose ahead of them against the sky, and somewhere past the next bend the creek was running, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and the work was waiting in the way. Work always waited, patiently, without judgment, just there. She didn't look back at the town. She was looking at what was ahead of her. It was enough.